honestly, the expectations that everyone has for Nvidia are already so aggressive that like just even beating them at all for such a big company is crazy. I mean, you're talking about the biggest company in the world growing revenues by 60% year over year. I mean, if Apple had that, it would be a $10 trillion company today, right? Like, it's insane that the biggest company in the world is also one of the fastest growing, in my opinion.
Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Monday. My name is Gav Blaxberg, and I am your host for today's Wolf Financial Live. Joining me is Alex from ticker symbol U. Thank you so much for jumping on today. I'm so excited to talk about Nvidia together with you.
Sure, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
I love it. So a lot of people follow your channel for a ton of information around Nvidia and semiconductors in general. So with earnings coming up and this year already being a crazy start to the market, especially for large cap tech, I thought what better time to have you on. Maybe we have to have a post earnings discussion as well. But for now, let's just kind of take it from the top rope. Nvidia has had two really incredible years of growth, prior to this, and even further than that. But these last 2 years, super transformative. They led the pack. Jensen Huang, became a top 10 richest person in the world. The company has been at the forefront of creating technology that is changing the universe. So from a high level perspective, first off, just give me your thoughts on Nvidia in 2026, and then we'll dive a little deeper from there.
Yeah, I think everything you just said really hit the nail on the head. Nvidia is really the platform that I think is catapulting AI into the present and into the future, right? So because so much of computing is moving from the traditional like retrieval sense of computing, and we can get into like the specifics of all the jargon I'm about to say, but at a high level, computing is changing in a big way, right? It's moving from CPUs to GPUs, and with that, there are a lot of implications about like how cloud services should run, how data centers should run, how even edge devices should run. And NVIDIA's technology is really at the center of that. So I think, like you pointed out, they had 2+ years of fantastic growth. I actually think they're going to have multiple years more of fantastic growth because it turns out that the way we do computing across the board, like I just mentioned, is about to change significantly. And so that's trillions of dollars of infrastructure that needs to get refreshed, ripped out, changed. And as far as I'm concerned, NVIDIA has no real competition for that space. So.
Yeah, they are definitely about to put a lot of money into this. So if you look at the one common thing that we've seen across the board during large cap tech earnings, it is that they're going to spend a boatload of money moving forward here. I retweeted something yesterday that I'm just pulling up on my timeline for a sec to look at, but it had basically projections of how much money these companies were going to spend over the next, whatever it is, couple of years. And it just was a bonkers number. So it looks like the CapEx expenditure as a percentage of sales. This is a projection. This is moving from 2019 to 2026, actually. Meta went from 21% to 54% of their sales in CapEx. Alphabet went from 15% to 40%. Microsoft from 11% to 33%. And even Amazon from 6 to 25%. The only one that didn't was Apple. Apple went from 4% down to 3%. So they're the only one that's not spending. But NVIDIA, you'd think this move up as well. So talk to me about like these massive amounts of CapEx that they're spending and how do you think the market's reacting to that?
Yeah, I mean, look, let's just take it from first principles, right? These numbers sound like big and scary. If you look at them from a finance perspective, one thing we try to do on my channel is never look at things just purely from an accounting lens. So let's back up even a little more. What are they doing? They're securing power, they're securing land, and they're securing GPUs that are supply limited, right? So fundamentally, what's going on is a digital land grab. You know what I'm saying? So when Amazon locks down,
but in a physical aspect.
Digital in the sense of like they're produced. The output is always going to be tokens, right? The inputs are going to be land, power, cooling, chips, etc. Right? So physical land grab, but like to produce something digital.
Yep.
Okay. When Google buys a new data center, which it's more than just buying a data center, right? They secure a piece of land, they secure the power for that land, they put chips in it, they start powering it, and then they start producing tokens out of it. That is a package that no one else can buy now, right? So that piece of land is now secured. There's only so much power in the world. There's only so much free space in the world. There are only so many GPUs in the world because they're constantly supply limited. So of course these companies are spending every dollar they can to secure those assets now, because every time they do that, that's something their competitors can't secure, right? It is a zero-sum game because these resources are finite, which is something the market I don't think is really used to thinking about, right? For example, software as a service, which has been collapsing, is not a finite resource, right? You can keep producing licenses on the same code base that you've already built, but you
Exactly.
can't secure land and power that somebody else has already secured. So these companies, these are very smart, well-run, multi-trillion dollar machines, right? They understand that if Microsoft gets something, Meta can't get it. If Google gets something, Amazon can't get it. So that's why it's such a big land grab up front.
Well, a couple of questions and thoughts off that. One, is it not only, hey, we're taking this away from other people, but also this could potentially be one of the highest ROI investments that we ever make, right? Like, we're better to put our dollars. Do you think that that's a lot of the thought process for me is like, why would they go and spend, $50 billion on something if they haven't run the numbers? What you outlined makes sense, competitive advantage. I'm thinking about it from ROI.
Yeah, of course. So like there would be no competition if everyone didn't think there was going to be massive ROI in this space, right? So I guess good
They go
job like
hand in
saying it
hand.
explicitly, but yeah, implied in all this is these investments will have high returns forever and ever, honestly, right? So like let's back up. If these data centers don't do a good job producing ROI for AI, they can always be repurposed as traditional digital infrastructure, right? To power the cloud services that they're already running today. So Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and Meta platforms for themselves already run huge cloud services and lots of different things on top of that for millions, if not billions of customers, right? At least billions of machines. So it's not like, oh, the whole AI thing blew up. This is all dead investment. It can always be repurposed because it's still raw computing power that can get pointed at the next thing.
And what about Nvidia? Where do they play into that?
I mean, you're talking about the infrastructure that everyone's buying, right? So when people are buying land, power, and data centers, they're filling it with NVIDIA's AI infrastructure. Their chips, their networking solutions, their DPUs, their CPUs, like all that stuff is quickly moving to NVIDIA because NVIDIA is supplying the infrastructure for parallel compute, for AI compute. So yeah, everyone else is owning the data centers, but what's inside them is going to be largely NVIDIA, and we can also talk about AMD, but it's mainly NVIDIA, about 90%.
Okay, so hold that thought. We will get into NVIDIA versus competitors, but let's fast forward a little bit here to the earnings call and just walk me through, expectations for the earnings call, what the average retail investor should be watching out for, key things to know. Like, you're going into there with what questions, hoping to get what answers?
Basically, the same questions that everyone always has is like, are we still supply constrained, or is there an issue? Are there any issues with demand? How is Blackwell Ultra ramping, and what's happening with Rubin? Blackwell Ultra is their current generation GPU platform.
Mhm.
Rubin is their next upcoming generation GPU platform. So we care about how well sales are doing of their current generation, the thing that's shipping right now and soon, as well as how production is ramping for the next generation. I'm looking for something around 60% revenue growth. That's sort of the median of what we've had for the last 3 or 4 quarters. So that implies like a $62 billion revenue run rate.
Mm.
Again, expecting the same margins we have and all that. So yeah, honestly, like what I'm looking for is like a meet or a slight beat on expectations. I don't expect too much more than that because honestly, the expectations that everyone has for Nvidia are already so aggressive that
Yeah.
like just even beating them at all for such a big company is crazy. I mean, you're talking about the biggest company in the world growing revenues by 60% year over year. I mean, if Apple had that, it would be a $10 trillion company today, right? Like, it's insane that the biggest company in the world is also one of the fastest growing, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's insane, especially with those margins, right? It's not just about the growth, but the margins that they have and being able to
Yeah.
sustain margins like that year after year after year, even
On
as you're
hardware,
having
by the way, right? Software like margins on hardware. So, sorry, go
better,
ahead.
better than some of the software margins, to be honest,
Yeah.
that you're seeing out there. So yeah, no, you absolutely nailed it. What are some things that would be red flags for you if you heard them in the call?
Yeah, so like a couple of the big red flags for me consistently have been around the political climate. So
Mm.
the Trump administration has sort of gone back and forth on whether AI chips from NVIDIA, the high-end NVIDIA AI chips, should be allowed to be sold to China and in what capacity, as well as what kind of taxation or like percentage revenue comes off the top that goes to the U.S. government, right? So anytime I hear about policy changes in the earnings call, like, oh, this is the latest, this is how it's affecting demand, that's what I think makes people the most nervous, because the AI market in China is probably the biggest AI market in the world. About half of all AI developments, research, the major competition, it's all coming out of China. So if Nvidia can't sell into that, that's a huge portion of the global market that they're missing. And because that situation seems to be so volatile just from a policy perspective, I think every quarter when we get like the latest update, it's like, oh, the stock is going to go down a little bit just because like there's so much uncertainty around that segment. Sorry, that market, I should say.
Can you, for those that maybe don't have context, I know you're outlining that it's 50% of all, but maybe numbers wise, like when you look at the revenue growth and the revenue expectations, like what could China do to those if they had clarity?
Yeah, so I have to like go look it up online at this point, but for a while, China was $0 of revenue, right? So guidance going forward would be $0 because the policy around it was Nvidia is not allowed to export chips to China. And then
That's
they
'cause they don't
were
want China to have an advantage over the US, right?
exactly. And then that narrative literally flipped 180 because it's like, well, if China doesn't depend on US, then they'll be independent. They'll have an independent AI supply chain, which is even worse, right? Because now they can develop at their own pace. And also now they have less of an incentive to, I'm trying to word it carefully, but basically, you know,
Yeah.
Taiwan is a large part of that supply chain,
Yes,
right?
yes, yes,
So they
yes.
have less of an incentive to avoid aggression towards Taiwan, for lack of a more
Yeah.
sensitive way to say it, right?
Yeah. Pulling a US going into Venezuela. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. So like I think there's a lot of sensitivity around that situation because it's so core to the AI supply chain, not
Very
just for
fair.
Nvidia, but everyone upstream and downstream. So anyway, so focusing on the revenue for Nvidia though, right? So because guidance for the last few quarters was zero revenue for China from China, right now it's actually all upside, right? So if they announce, hey, we're selling into the billions again in China, that's all like unexpected billions of dollars, right?
Right.
But that can easily flip into the negative, right? If we have a few good quarters of good, strong sales into China, and then the policy changes again, now we're looking at an immediate revenue drop of those same billions, which is what we've seen happen in the past, right? Like when the policy changed the first time and took Nvidia out of the China market. So that's not really Nvidia's fault, but it is their problem. So that's usually what a lot of people end up, quote unquote, worrying about on the earnings call. I think, like, just to sort of hedge that statement a little bit, now I think investors, definitely myself included, I definitely have faith that Nvidia will navigate these situations to the best of their ability. Like the business clearly didn't crater or collapse because they got pulled out of China last time. So we know that they're really good at like understanding and managing any policy risks and that they can kind of navigate that scene as it unfolds. So I'm not too worried, but that's definitely my biggest worry.
Yeah, that's something that certainly people will be looking for on the call. One other thing on the earnings call, which I'm sure people will talk about, is the potential OpenAI investment and how big it's actually going to be. And I do wonder if they'll be brave enough to ask Jensen. They've seen his reaction to the last reporter that asked. But what do you think's happening there, and how much do you think that actually affects the stock?
I'm honestly not sure. And I mean, it just really depends on like what's going on from like a hardware perspective versus an investing perspective. So from a hardware perspective, I'm not worried at all, right? Because if chips don't go to OpenAI, they're going to get gobbled up by every other AI lab, hyperscaler, like you name it, right?
Sure.
So from a supplying those GPUs, getting them deployed and fully utilized perspective, I think it's like just all noise, whether it goes to OpenAI or somebody else. From an investment perspective, I think I would rather not be OpenAI in this situation, right? Because
Mm.
if Nvidia decides not to deploy that capital, like now Nvidia just has that capital again to deploy it somewhere else. Uh, if I was OpenAI and I had what is it like $100 billion on the line or something, you
Yeah.
know, I'm aggressively doing whatever it takes to make sure Nvidia still thinks I'm the best model maker in the room, right? So I'm not like super worried. Like I would be a lot more worried if they had already invested in it and then all the drama unfolded and now they're like, well, wait a minute, what is the real value of the investment we just made? But yeah, I guess I maybe I should be more worried about it than I am. But you know, Nvidia is sort of like in the seat of power on that
What
investment. You know,
What else would you like to see them do with their cash on hand?
it's a good question. So I don't really have like a good answer for that because every time I say something like that, they end up just doing it anyway. So let me give you an example. A few years ago, I was surprised when Nvidia kept pounding the table on training, and I was sort of saying just on my little YouTube channel, hey, I wouldn't be surprised if Nvidia came out with like an inference-focused version of their GPU to try to tackle the inference market. Nvidia today has a chip called the Rubin CPX. The CPX is designed to tackle a specific part of the inference step, and they've done a lot more things within the rest of their hardware ecosystem to like specifically so they can talk about inference performance. You know what I mean? Same thing with networking. Back in the day, they were exclusively on quantum InfiniBand, right? Which means they didn't really compete in Ethernet-based data centers. Today, they have like the best Ethernet networking solutions, Spectrum-X Ethernet specifically. So I think they're just going to keep doing that. If I was them and I was, the Grok acquisition, non-acquisition, whatever you want to call it, right?
Yeah.
So I think we're going to see a lot more of that if they don't deploy that capital with OpenAI, where it's like, what other part of the stack can we aggressively redesign or co-design to keep expanding the reasons that people want to use at least some of our stack, right? Whether it's memory, they just announced like a new cool rack level memory solution. I've been pounding the table on high bandwidth memory for a couple years now because that's been a big limiter in the supply chain. You can go kind of down and down the list: memory, networking, power solutions. I wouldn't be surprised if they aggressively went after like different ways of like power and cooling. The list goes on and on, but anywhere in the stack that becomes a bottleneck is what they should be pointing those funds at.
Yeah, it seems like they're getting a lot more efficient with the cooling as well. They talked about it at CES, moving from 80% cooling to 100%, and having continuous cycle and circle, so you're able to reuse that water, and it can be like 45 degrees Celsius or something. It didn't have to be that cold. So it seems like they've solved a lot of that. Memory's been a really big topic lately, and you're also investing in memory as well, right? I think I saw your list of top 10 stocks for the year had was MU on there?
Yeah, Micron. Yep, sure was.
Yep, was looking at that. Saw Micron on there. I don't know if you look at any of these other companies which are like SK Hynix, overseas, but the gains there are pretty incredible.
Yeah. So I personally do. I try to keep my channel focused on the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ because that just tends to be the largest exchanges that my audience can invest in. But yeah, of course, like personally, I'm very interested in SK Hynix, Samsung, Micron, any market where only 2 or 3 stocks represent the whole market. I just like to own the whole market, right? So Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, that's a super easy, comfortable basket of stocks to own. Right. That's like 60 to 70% of the global cloud computing market, right? It's the same with memory. If you can own SK Hynix, Samsung, and Micron in 3 stocks, you own like 90% of the entire high bandwidth market, right? So anytime you can do that in 2 or 3 stocks, Nvidia and AMD for GPUs, right? Throw in Broadcom and you've covered a lot of ASICs as well. You're done. So I really like this approach of like just own the market. That's done very well for me.
That is a good approach. Jensen's talked a lot here about how memory is kind of the limiter, I would say, right now. They just need more high bandwidth memory. Can you explain for somebody that's just maybe not so technical why memory is the limiter right now and if there are any other things similar to it?
Sure. So like GPUs have gotten a lot more powerful very quickly over the last couple generations, right? So fundamentally the problem, let's back up a couple years. What's the big problem? The big problem is being able to compute fast enough to get answers from AI in a reasonable time frame, right? So what do? You connect a whole bunch of GPUs together with high speed networks, and you get them to act like one giant GPU. The GPUs get a lot better. What's the next bottleneck? The next bottleneck is going to be the network connecting them together, right?
Right.
If that network is slow, it doesn't matter how fast the GPUs are. Some GPUs are just waiting for that information to cross the network, get to them, then they send back the answer. The final machine is waiting for the last answer to put everything together, to compile the final solution, to send out the answer back to the user, right? So the bottleneck in that situation is no longer the chips. It's the network connecting them together. Okay, now the chips are fast and the network is fast. How does data actually like get computed. What happens is the data gets stored in memory, then it gets sent to the GPU. I'm speaking at a very high level, by the way, right?
Yeah.
It gets sent to the GPU. That GPU computes, sends the answer back over the network, right? Right now, the big bottleneck is how fast can that GPU retrieve and access lots and lots and lots and lots of data from memory. So that's the big trick is it's a lot of memory. Sorry, it's a lot of data that's stored in memory, right?
Yeah.
So it takes time to retrieve or read that, and then it takes that time to compute. Right now, that actually ends up being one of the big bottlenecks. So you need faster memory, you need denser memory, and you need it to be what is called higher bandwidth, which just means you can push more data through it at once. That memory, because that's such a big bottleneck, people are trying to buy the best memory they can to alleviate that bottleneck, which means it's now supply limited. You can only get as much memory, going back to what we started the conversation with data centers. Only so much memory exists on the planet that can help solve these problems, right? Specifically HBM4 memory and HBM3 high bandwidth memory, right? If I can secure all that memory, you can't, right? So if I can get all that memory baked into my chips, put in giant orders, secure up the supply, you're not getting it. That gives me a competitive advantage, right? So long story short, memory is one of those big bottlenecks in the large AI process of getting lots of chips to act like one giant GPU. Therefore, memory is an important thing to tackle and secure and upgrade so that that's no longer the thing limiting the rate of AI.
Very good breakdown. And understanding this land grab, as you're putting it, does it feel like this, next 1 to 3 years is kind of the formational period to set up the next 10 to 20 of AI? Because like you said, eventually there's going to be a point where it's very limited resources, but right now is where everybody's making the investments.
Yeah. I don't know if it's exactly the next 2 or 3 years versus the next let's say 5 to 7. I'm not really good at these things. Always seem to happen slower than an investor would want and then faster than we expect, right? So but I definitely think the land grab is the right way to think about it. So it's not like the computer era, it's more like the railroad era, the real estate era, the frontier era. It's like if we can lock up these resources, we being whatever company you're rooting for, right?
Right.
If you can sort of lock up these core, non-fungible, finite resources before everyone else, you have those resources to play with forever, right? So the more data center land space, the more power, the more memory, the more chips, whatever that finite resource is, the more you can lock up today, the more you can outcompete your competitors, right? And then go ahead. Sorry.
No, please finish the thought.
An important part of that, that's maybe a little in the weeds, is right now there's this big, everyone's raising an eyebrow because big companies are depreciating their assets over longer periods of time. Right. So, nutshell, they're saying, hey, my AI chips should be depreciated over 6 years, not 3. I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the future, where these assets also last longer and longer because they get upgraded over time, they get more used over time, their prices can get lowered over time. The amount I charge you to rent a GPU from me can go down over time so that GPU stays utilized longer, and you're incentivized to use some older chips because maybe you don't need the latest ones, so that they actually stay in data centers longer. And if that happens, that's another catalyst to see profits from all these companies go through the roof that people aren't really accounting for, I think, because they're just taking for granted these weird accounting things,
Yeah, in a similar vein, one of the questions that people ask a lot is what's going to happen as some of these chips get outdated, right? What's going to happen as some of the hardware gets outdated?
Yeah.
One thing which was interesting, talking with Dion Harris at CES and, Jensen, just hearing from him, was that they're constantly pushing updates, right? Even to these older chips. And so just because you may not have, right, you may not upgrade to a Rubin, right? You still are getting upgrades consistently. You might not even be on Blackwell yet. You're still getting upgrades consistently. And so it seems like they can keep those chips outputting, but does there get to be a point in your mind where it's okay, you're just going to have to strip everything out and reset back up, or how you're going to upgrade? How do you think about it?
Yeah, so I think you're actually spot on. So let me answer that question sort of backwards, right? I don't think until somebody says it, it's not obvious how big these upgrades are, right? So A couple years ago, Nvidia pushed a package upgrade, a software upgrade to all of their chips called Tensor RT LLM. It's a bunch of alphabet soup, but basically what this upgrade did was it made all of their chips roughly twice as good at inference for large language models. Twice as good, 100% gain. So it affected their Blackwell chips, it affected their Hopper chips, it affected their Ampere chips. Like it was every generation of chip that had whatever version of CUDA on it or above, which is like most of their chips in data centers, got twice as good overnight at large language model inference, right? If your chip is twice as good, and Moore's law says chips get twice as good every 2 years, right? You should theoretically have just added 2 years to the lifetime of that chip if all it does is crunch numbers for LLMs, right? Like for the inference side of LLMs. So that one upgrade, if we were depreciating these chips over 3 years before, in my opinion, I'm not an accountant, right? I'm an engineer. It would be fair to depreciate that chip over 5 years instead of 3. That's what's going on here at a high level. Is these companies are claiming we actually are using these chips longer. Their useful lifetime is longer, not just because of upgrades, but because you can think about the opposite problem too. The chip is getting worse over time because other chips are getting better, right? Like, I'm installing newer and newer chips that everyone wants to use, so the old chips look worse by comparison. Sure. But if it's 50% worse, and I just say, okay, the price to rent this chip is 50% lower, now your performance per watt, performance per dollar, however you're measuring your compute, like the economics work out to be the same, right? It's 50% worse, but I'm charging you 50% less. That chip gets fully utilized, right? Like, because I might not need the fastest chip, I just might need chip like compute capacity, and I'll run my problem overnight. It doesn't talk to a real customer. It doesn't need real-time responses. I want to set up a problem in the evening and have the answer in the morning. Older chips are absolutely capable of doing that, right? So that's another way to get more useful life out of the chip, which goes back to what you were saying, right? It's not about upgrading and replacing. I think we're still in the phase where people are doing the giant land grab, standing up new servers, putting up the best chips they can. Why the best chips they can, by the way? Because they're the most compute dense. If I get the most compute dense chips, I can fit more and more racks into the same space, and I can get more and more compute out of the same amount of power, right? That's why we want the latest generation, not just because like, oh, it's the hot new thing. Every generation is much more power efficient, which lets me cram more chips into the same facility, same power, same budget, right? So that's, go ahead.
I think the everyday consumer can, comprehend that pretty easily. It's like upgrading from your M1 to your M4 MacBook Pro, Same computer, same size computer, takes the same amount of power, operates much better, right?
Yeah, same with my phone, right? Like it still fits in my pocket 10 times better than the phone was 4 years ago or whatever, right? But the other side is true, right? There will always be a good use for a 4-year-old phone. It might not be the flagship use, what we all want, but like there's somebody out there that's like, I would buy a 4-year-old phone at a 4-year discount, right? I would pay $300, which is what like phone companies pay us for our 4-year-old phones. I would pay $300 for a 4-year-old iPhone, right?
Is this going to translate into demand from other countries? Like you kind of have right now this huge push in the US, but you might see a secondary country, maybe it's in Europe, and companies are starting to land grab over there and they're willing to buy older chips at cheaper prices. Like, do you think there's markets that trail down?
I think so. So like a really good example of the kind of demand from other countries is what's called sovereign AI. A lot of people, we take this for granted because I think a large chunk of all AI development happens in Silicon Valley, in English. We just take for granted that like our culture is sort of baked into large language models. But there are plenty of other cultures, economies, religions, right, that want large language models and other kinds of models to sort of represent their culture, right? Their language. All of that stuff that we take for granted, but they need to train and fine tune their models to accomplish, right? Like think in a specific language or a specific dialect, represent imagery based on how our culture represents it, and so on. So sovereign AI is something that every country is going to want to invest in to make sure that their culture is protected in the AI era, just like it was protected in the internet era, where like everyone had their own voice, and et cetera, right? And online content, think about not just text. When we think of AI, we're often talking about large language models, but video, audio, right? All of these other things that are coming online, countries want to protect their cultures. So they're going to invest in their own AI stacks to make sure that they're well represented, you know?
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. All right, I want to move into, it took me a while to get here, but the topic that I kind of titled this whole thing, which is why NVIDIA's moat is so much bigger than people think. And you hit on this a little bit earlier in terms of them versus competitors. So we talked about, hey, huge demand and huge money going into land grab. And they're building these warehouses. And then what's going inside is like 90% NVIDIA. And I want to talk a little bit about why, first off, why people are choosing NVIDIA, right, over others, and how are they going to maintain that advantage moving into the future?
Yeah, so let's pick that apart real quick. Who are the others? You know,
AMD.
like AMD, right? So
Yeah.
AMD, like, what does AMD fundamentally sell?
Chips.
Oh, okay, but what kind of chips?
They are selling, I mean, they're not selling GPUs as well.
I mean, they are, but like most of AMD's business forever has been selling CPUs.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So majority is CPUs, but they're leaning into GPUs pretty hard now, right?
Sure, now and for a few years, I shouldn't discredit them
Okay.
anymore. Like, but AMD's business has always, for a large majority of AMD's life, their
Right.
main competitor was Intel, right?
Right. Tough
And they
scene.
did a, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was saying tough scene, you know, and your main competitor.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And like, to AMD's credit, they fought a long, hard uphill battle against Intel, and they're winning, right? Which is actually a really big feat. I mean, today we all laugh at Intel, but it's not too long ago that Intel was a titan of industry, owned the CPU market, that their x86 architecture is and was everywhere. They were a giant, and they were Goliath, and AMD was David, right? So not to discredit that at all, what AMD has done in the CPU market is incredible. But this is not the CPU market, right? This is the GPU market. And again, what AMD has been able to do in just a few short years, spinning up an enterprise GPU business from essentially zero to where they are today, capturing 2, 3, 4, 5% of the market, is huge. I don't want to discount that.
Yep.
But they are by far the second source compared to Nvidia, who has been tackling this entire stack for decades now. Nvidia started as a GPU company. The first thing they ever sold was a GPU. They've been focused on graphics and parallel computing from the beginning, and that's fundamentally what's happening today in AI. Not CPUs, GPUs. So, of course, Nvidia has a huge lead over AMD. They've been working on this same problem for much, much longer, and they've recruited all the best talent in the world for this very different way of doing computing. I don't think. Oh, go ahead.
I want to make sure the audience understands this too, because we're using the high level terminology and you are giving some breakdowns, but just explain to people GPU versus CPU, kind of the massive difference, especially where we're going.
Sure. Sorry. At a high level, a CPU, it's a central processing unit, right? So what does a CPU do? It takes in instructions, it processes those instructions one at a time, maybe a few at a time. You might have heard the term like multi-thread computing. So that's where a CPU can act as like 2 to 4 or, a small number of smaller CPUs doing things in parallel. But largely what a CPU does is it takes instructions in, chunks them up, solves the problem, moves on to the next set of instructions in serial, right? One thing at a time, or a low number of things at a time.
Right.
What a GPU does, GPUs are graphics processing units, but today we really think of them more as like parallel computers. Parallel is the exact opposite of serial. So what parallel does is it takes a problem, it has to be a specific kind of problem, it chunks it up into lots of tiny chunks, solves all of those chunks in parallel, which means at the same time, recombines all those solutions and gives the final output. So it's much faster, but it requires the problem be framed a certain way so that you can break it up into those tiny chunks and put them back together. It turns out that most problems on Earth can be chunked up that way, which is why GPUs have moved from being like specialized for like graphics and AI to being able to kind of do anything, is because we've learned that, that speed up is worth investing, making my problems look like a problem a GPU can chunk up, solve in parallel, put back together, and give you the solution much faster. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And that's where their competitive advantage is, like you were saying, having been in it for many years. A lot of people have always kind of had some rough estimates of how far behind AMD is to Nvidia. Do you have any thoughts on that in terms of the GPU scale?
Yeah, and again, this is actually to AMD's extreme credit. I think they're like 1.5 generations behind, right? So, and that's actually their biggest downfall, right? Is they're more than one generation behind. So what happens is as soon as they get to only half a generation behind, Nvidia announces their next thing and puts them 1.5 generations behind. So by the problem is these order cycles, the time it takes to stand up a data center, order and get your order fulfilled of all these GPUs, all that stuff has a really long lead time.
Yeah.
So if you know that NVIDIA's just going to announce something even more power efficient around the corner, you're just going to wait because that means you can put in more racks, more compute for the same power and land area, which we spent the whole first part of this podcast talking about. That's the limiting factor. So of course, I'm just going to wait for NVIDIA's next thing because that lets me put 40% more compute, let's say, in this data center, which lets me get 40% more tokens out of the same amount of land and power, which means 40% more revenue or returns on my investment, right?
Tokens are a great thing to discuss here as well. Jensen, I saw him speaking about this a day or two ago, talking about that vertical integration and how it's allowed them to have the cheapest tokens, essentially, if you could speak to that.
Yeah. So long story short, the big thing that's special with Rubin, right, this current generation coming out, is they co-designed 6 separate chips that all work together to make the Rubin platform roughly 10 times more power efficient than the Blackwell platform at the rack level, right? So you take one rack of all the Rubin equipment now, right? So not just GPUs, but there's CPUs in there, there's networking equipment, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in there. And you just compare it to one rack of the Blackwell generation, it's roughly 10 times more power efficient, right? So 10 times the compute for the same amount of power, or it can solve the same problem in 1/10 the power, whichever way you want to look at it, right? The reason they could do that is because of what you just said, that vertical integration. They own the GPU, they own the CPU, they own the networking technology inside there. They own the networking technology that connects the racks together. They own the network chips that connects all the chips together, so on and so forth. That because they're vertically integrated, because they own all those pieces, they could take them all apart, design them all together at the same time, and put them back together in a way that they all work together to help solve this power efficiency problem. Let's talk about AMD. AMD has amazing CPUs. Nobody's denying that. They have great GPUs. Nobody's denying that. But they run on Ethernet. They don't have anything like a DPU, a data processing unit, which is one of the 6 chips we just talked about. And they rely on other vendors for other specific pieces of their stack, which means they can't take those pieces, rip them apart, figure out how to make them work optimally for their GPUs and CPUs, put them back together, right? So because, I know you guys talk about Tesla a lot. One of Tesla's big advantages is they're fully vertically integrated, right?
Right.
That's the advantage that Nvidia is enjoying in its market versus competitors who rely on other vendors. Just like Tesla's competitors are automakers that have dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of vendors and sub-vendors and subcontractors, so there's no way they can optimize every part of their automobile, right?
Or even Waymo, who, right, it has to buy their cars off of Jaguar, right?
Totally, yeah, exactly. Like pound for pound, we're talking about parallels of the same advantage, right?
Yeah, very well broken down. So just to then reflect this to your portfolio, because you're pretty transparent with this stuff, obviously you're seeing a huge advantage here in NVIDIA, but you own both NVIDIA and AMD, right?
Yeah, and admittedly a lot more Nvidia than AMD, but yeah, like again, if you can own the market in just 2 or 3 companies, I'm a big bull, and it's a hot market, right? Like the reason to own the GPU market is it's growing something like 30-40% year over year, right? Just the market. So if both companies just maintain their market share, that's how fast they're growing, right? And we're seeing that in their earnings. Nvidia is growing by 50 or 60%. I think even AMD's data center business is growing that fast, and their overall revenues are still something like 35, if not 40%, right? That's great. I mean, so if I can own the GPU market in just 2 stocks, I'm doing it.
So then where does the rest of the supply chain factor in for you? Names like AVGO, which is also inside there, Taiwan Semi, right? How do you think about those factoring into NVIDIA as a whole?
Yeah, so that's another. I don't really think about them as factoring into Nvidia as a whole. I try to own like the whole market or the whole ecosystem, right? So Nvidia and AMD, that's the GPU side of the equation. Maybe even let's call it the rack level side of the equation.
Sure.
But if you want to talk about other ways of doing computing, AVGO and Google are really the king of what are called ASICs, right? Application specific integrated circuits. GPUs tend to be more general in the sense that they can tackle a wide variety of parallel problems. ASICs tend to be more specific, which is how they get their name. Like this ASIC is really meant for large language models. This ASIC is really good for video models. That's very high level, but like there are different kinds of chips to solve different kinds of AI problems, and that makes them limited to those problems, but it also makes them faster than GPUs at solving those problems. Does that make sense? They're specialized.
Exactly. Yeah, they're specialized.
Yeah, so I also want to own the ASIC market, right? And as you just pointed out, AVGO, Broadcom, Google has their own TPUs, which Broadcom helped co-design, and even Microsoft and Amazon have their own versions of these chips. Amazon has Trainium, Meta has their MTIA chips, and Microsoft has their Azure Maya and Cobalt chips, right? So forgetting the names, these are specialized AI chips that run in these specific clouds. So by owning those companies, now I have a portfolio that covers all the technology, no matter what wins. GPUs versus ASICs, this cloud versus that cloud, right? Add in Taiwan Semiconductor. Now I own the company making all the chips because Taiwan Semi makes about 90% of all advanced chips, right? So
They feel like such a good bet right now.
I
don't
mean,
know.
they've been a good bet for years and years, man. Like I love like if there's one company I've been shilling, pounding the table on, it's actually TSMC. Yeah.
Yeah, just an incredible company. I don't know if they get enough recognition for
They
what
do
they
not.
do, and they're also like they're hitting new all time highs today. I
Yeah.
believe. I think it's new all time highs today. They're up 14% year to date. They're up 71% in the past year. They, I mean, they've had an Nvidia like run, I guess, if you go all the way back to 2014, but recently, the last couple years, the stocks maybe had a double, triple, but it hasn't gone parabolic quite yet in these recent years, which it feels like it totally could.
I think it'll always be limited by the fact that its end customers are companies with their own end customers, right? There's only so much profit they can extract from their clientele. The further you move down the chain, obviously, and I mean, it seems like we're in a weird time right now, right? Because everything in AI is so profitable at the hardware level, which is like very different than the economics of the previous era, where it's like, oh, the software that's built on top of it is where all the profits accrue, right? That's kind of like the mental model everyone sort of had of the market. But because things are so supply constrained and supply limited at the hardware level, and AI, the software is still so new with so much room to grow, all the
Yeah.
profits are accruing like sort of in the hardware layer right now.
Unless,
So TS, oh, go ahead.
unless you're Palantir.
Unless you're Palantir, for sure. But that I think we'll look back and we'll see that Palantir is the first real big enterprise software company of the AI era, specifically of the AI era, right? Like their big advantage is they're AI first in a world where people are still software as a service, right? They're really AI as a service. So, and we can talk about that, but yeah, we're in this weird spot where profit is accruing to hardware. So, and because TSMC has an effective monopoly, they get to charge what they want. But if they charge too much, there's no room for profit, above them in the stack. So then their clients are like, hey man, I can't produce these chips because even if I do, I'm not making any money here, right? So there's a fine balance of how much TSMC can charge for their packaging, for their, for making the chips themselves and all that. So I think they'll always be a little bit limited just by where they are in the supply chain.
Makes sense. Nvidia's like, hey man, we need to make 60% profit margins here, right?
Yeah. It's like we have
Take this
margins to
cost
protect.
down.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally fair. Okay, I want to talk some about the applications of these things.
Sure.
Jensen's talked a lot about this. Elon's talked a lot about this. Physical AI seems to be like the next big thing that's going to be powered by all this. We've got humanoid robots, self-driving, all these other ways that it factors into things. They had Alpamayo, which they talked about at CES. Tesla obviously has FSD. What do you think about this physical AI concept and how it could be powered by NVIDIA?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's much more than a concept at this point. I think we've seen real robots that are whether they're powered by Nvidia or not, I think robots are definitely one of the next big platforms of the future, right? Like if we look back, if we can jump forward in time and look back at where we are today, this is like we'll see a new iPhone moment coming up. We'll see a new laptop moment coming up. We'll see a new cell phone moment coming up. Like there was a time before you and I where people carried suitcases and inside that suitcase was a single cell phone. You know what I mean? It was a mobile phone. And that was amazing to people. And then there was a time where a computer couldn't fit on our desks, right? It took up a whole room in some government lab, and like it used physical punch cards that got physical bugs stuck in them, which is why their software bugs are called bugs, is because like these physical cards, right? Like
I didn't know
all this
that.
stuff that, oh yeah, they were punch cards with like dots in a specific order that would tell the computer what to do. And if it didn't work, you would pull it out and you'd realize a literal bug was on it. You
Wow.
would wipe off the bug, right? This is pre blowing into a Nintendo cartridge. You would stick the thing back in bug free and it would work, right?
That's crazy.
That's where software bugs come from, right? Now, today, so why am I saying all this? Today, computers fit in our pocket, right? Like we take it for granted today because we've had it so long, but there was a moment, the iPhone moment, where phones no longer had buttons. They were incredibly powerful. They were buttonless laptops that go in our pocket, right? The next big platform, one of the next big physical platforms is robots. I say one of because it's like robots really mean multiple different things. Cars that drive us instead of us driving them, robots. Humanoid robots doing our laundry or whatever the big use case is going to be first, robots. But there are going to be digital robots too. We call them AI agents today, but we're going to look back and realize that these digital AI agents are just software robots. You know what I mean? They're robots that just exist inside computers. And when you think about things through that lens, yes, that's definitely the next big thing coming.
Have you set up a Claude or a moat bot?
I'm actively working through whatever it's called now. I don't know if it's still called Claudebot, but I'm trying to stand up a few AI agents. I'm admittedly not that good at it, but it's a work in progress. Yeah.
Just a fun little tidbit on that. I don't know if you saw, somebody created, I don't know if it's an API or whatever they would call it, but they basically made a software that would set up Moltbot for you in like 5 minutes. So you didn't have to deal with any of the stuff. And that software, I think they just vibe coded it to make that software. And then within 5 days, they listed that software for sale and got offers of over $2 million.
Oh my God. Yeah.
It's just it is a land grab right now for everything.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah. So I've been looking into something called OpenClaw. Anyway, yeah. There's a lot going on right now. I'm just trying to figure out even the vocabulary to talk about it at this point. But yeah.
Yeah. Really, really cool stuff. Last couple of rapid fire topics. So we're talking about land and power and things having finite space, but what about outer space? What about Mars? Do we not have such a limited area? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think these are actually really good and clever ideas, right? So for example, up in space, what do you get? You get lots of cooling for free. You have infinite area for free, and you have basically infinite power from the sun for free, right? Obviously, it takes a lot to launch that mass into space, assemble it, get everything working. There's all sorts of questions about how you do that with people, right? Like data centers need lots of people to run. They're not facilities that are like just empty. There's a lot of actually very technically skilled people that need to be there to run things, troubleshoot machines, stand up machines. There's a lot of human in the loop stuff there, right? Which is why I don't think data centers in space will happen tomorrow. But if you can launch compute into space, the next big problem is like, how do you beam the results back to Earth? In like, that definitely becomes the bottleneck, right? It's like, now I need to punch this signal through the atmosphere, get it in a coherent, fast way, and then do whatever with it, right? And then the question is the latency from here to there worth all that big structural investment, given that the latency of running fibers from Earth is like much faster, right? So I think we'll see that, but there's like a lot of things that need to get solved first, from the humans in space problem to the like building and setting it up space and problem, and then like the latency problem from here to there, depending on where there even is, like geostationary orbit on Mars or the moon. Like there's a lot of what ifs, right?
Yeah, Elon, we need you to figure out how to run fiber from space back down to Earth through the atmosphere.
And maybe they're like, so one of the things that like, funny enough, this is like I've had this conversation a few times this week. I guess this is like a big topic like right now, and I didn't realize it. But like, so what if there was a space elevator, but instead of being for like rocket ships and people and whatever, it's like specifically just for fiber cables. It just exists to connect like a few cables in a way that won't break from us to wherever this data center is. And now it can be ultra light, right? Because it's like, it's fiber, not, mass and moving and rocket engines and people and whatever. I thought that was a pretty cool idea, but obviously I have no idea if that would work in practice. So
Yeah, gonna need someone who understands thermodynamics better than me.
physics, yeah, gravity, atmosphere, yeah, right, yeah.
Yeah, very cool, very cool. We're coming to the end of this here, but I thoroughly enjoyed. I feel like people who watch probably have a much better idea of not just Nvidia but their moat. I think one of the things that factors into their moat is Jensen, and we haven't really talked about him as a person throughout this, but just any general thoughts there?
So I've been lucky enough to speak with Jensen a few times. I think he's super impressive. He's exactly what he sounds like and looks like on TV. He's super down to earth, super chill, happy to give you really the time of day when you ask him a question. I think he's the right guy for the job, right? He's obsessive. He thinks about this stuff morning, noon, and night. He loves what he does. I think one of the things that people often overlook or take for granted is how flat NVIDIA's structure is. I think he has something like 40 or 50 direct reports. There's not a big hierarchy in this company. It's actually a pretty small company for its market cap. And what that implies is there's a lot of autonomy at every individual level. Everyone's trusted to do their job. Everyone reports just one level up. There's not a lot of meetings. The culture there is a healthy mindset of get your job done, not like corporate politics and all that. So I think as important as Jensen is to NVIDIA, there's not a lot of key man risk there. I bet if he left tomorrow and he got replaced, the company culture would largely stay the same because he did such a good job of building that culture from the ground up and from the hierarchy down. You know what I mean?
Super, super interesting. While the company culture may stay the same, I think the stock price would not.
At least for a little while, but yeah, if it tanked because of that, I would buy it all day, man. Like,
wow. Okay. Very cool. That's also when you can kind of testify to the prowess of a founder, but also to the way that they've set their company up to continue after them. I did get the chance to ask him one question. I don't know if I got exactly the time of day.
I remember.
But it wasn't something I guess he could answer. So it is what it is. Really enjoyed the conversation. I would love to have you back on after NVIDIA earnings.
Sure.
Any final thoughts, anything else that we didn't touch on today that you want to share with the audience?
I think when it comes to NVIDIA or any company in general, I think one big thing I want to touch on is obviously these companies have generated extreme returns over the last few years. It's not always going to be like that. One thing that I've been doing lately, and I would encourage others to at least think about for themselves, is if you're sitting on 1,000, 2,000, 3,000% returns, it's okay to sell a little bit, even if you believe in the company, and enjoy your life today. One thing I've been doing a little more lately is treating my family and my friends to dinner, going out, spending a night for myself. I've actually been starting to sell a few of my stocks, tiny pieces, right? Fractions of a percent, whatever. But don't wait to retirement to enjoy the things that you've spent so long building, right? If you caught this AI era early, like many of us have and many of our audience has, just think about today, not always tomorrow is what I would say, right? As exciting as AI is tomorrow and as sky high as these valuations can get, your mental health, your life, especially in all the weird times going on right now, just make sure you take care of yourself, especially if you have the means to do it. Don't look back 30 years from now and say, I wish I spent a little more on myself along the way. That's what I would say.
Great message. I would compound upon that with especially if you're buying something, for yourself that you're going to use many, 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 many times. Maybe buy the thing that's spend the extra $100. Get the second level of it. If you're buying your computer chair, get a slightly nicer computer chair.
Do it.
Whatever these things are, especially if you have that ability.
Yeah, but invest in yourself. All the tropes about my channel name aside, I really think the best investment you can make if you have the money is in you.
Well put. Very well put. And obviously, the channel is ticker symbol U. Any shout outs as to just the general content people can find there and what the schedule of content is on Twitter and YouTube?
I kind of post whenever I want. I post about 6 videos a month, so my schedule is a little all over the place. You can find me on YouTube, ticker symbol U. I really only cover AI and semiconductor stocks. That's what my background is. I'm kind of locked in on that. I know that software stocks have kind of been on a not so hot trend lately, so probably we'll talk about that in the future and why I stick to hardware. But yeah, find me on YouTube, every 5 or 6 days.
Boom. Everybody, make sure you go checking it out. Subscribe to the channel. Thank you to all that watched our live stream here today. This was super fun. So if you were on Twitter watching it live, you got it in real time. If you are on YouTube, we'll get this up there shortly so that you can rewatch and catch all the best parts. Thank you to Alex. Thank you to the audience for tuning in. That's going to do it for today. Let's look forward to a great NVIDIA earnings. Take care, everyone. We'll see you on the next one.
Thanks for having me.